My name is Caroline Moynihan. I am the adult librarian at the Lethbridge Public Library, and we are so grateful to be having Mary Lawson speak with us today. Before we begin, I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement. So the Lethbridge Public Library acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Mary Lawson was born and brought up in a small farming community in Ontario. She is the author of Crow Lake and The Other Side of the Bridge, both international bestsellers. Crow Lake was a New York Times bestseller and was chosen as the book of the year by the New York Times and the Washington Post, among others. The Other Side of the Bridge was long-listed for the Man Booker Prize. Her latest novel, Road Ends, was a national bestseller and a finalist for the Folio Prize. Her new novel, the Canadian bestseller A Town Called Solace, was long-listed for the Booker Prize. Mary lives in England and returns to Canada frequently. Well, maybe not frequently lately, but hopefully
not
soon.
Not frequently lately, that's right. Sadly, I would have if I possibly could, but we couldn't.
Before Mary gives us a little bit of her book, reads a little bit of her book, if anybody has any questions at any time, just pop them in the question and answer at the bottom, and we'll read them after Mary does a little reading from her book.
Okay, I'm going to read the first page. Chapter 1, Clara. There were 4 boxes, big ones. They must have lots of things in them because they were heavy. You could tell by the way the man walked when he carried them in, stooped over, knees bent. He brought them right into Mrs. Orchard's house next door to Clara's that first evening and put them on the floor in the living room and then just left them there. That meant the boxes didn't have necessary things in them, things he needed straight away like pajamas, or he'd have unpacked them. The boxes were in the middle of the floor, which made Clara fidgety. Every time the man came into the living room, he had to walk around them. If he put them against a wall, he wouldn't have had to do that, and it would have looked much neater. And why would he bring them in from his car and then not unpack them? At first, Clara thought that it meant that he was delivering them for Mrs. Orchard, and she would unpack them herself when she got home. But she hadn't come home, and the boxes were still there, and so was the man, who didn't belong. Okay, that's page 1, and actually that was the very beginning of the novel started with that image. I saw a child, a little girl. Turns out she's standing in the window of the living room, watching a man carry 4 boxes, one after another, into a house next door. And I didn't know what was in the boxes or who the man was or who owned the house next door or anything, except that I had the idea that Clara was not happy about that development. So the story all grew out of that first scene.
Beautiful. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about your book for maybe those who haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yes, there are 3 characters. I decided that logically we were going to want to know who the person next door was. And we know he's a guy. I decided he was about 40. He was a city boy. He was coming into this house because he'd been given it by the old woman who owned it, Mrs. Orchard. And it turns out that she is the 3rd of 3 characters in the book. And their chapters rotate one after another. We have Clara, and then Mrs. Orchard, and then the man, Liam, who is 35, I think, and in a very bad part of his life. Not that his life has been a bunch of roses anyway, but at the moment he is just divorced and has just walked out of his job and leaves Toronto and drives up through miles and miles and miles of forests and lakes and rocks. And he is monumentally unimpressed by the scenery and by this town. And about 12 hours after he brings his boxes into the house, he gets a visit from the police. And it appears that he is suspected of a crime. Now, Clara next door is in, if anything, a worse situation. Her adored older sister, Rose, who's 16, had a flaming row with their mother 12 days before this man arrives, and stormed out of the house saying, "You will never see me again," and has not been seen since. And there's been an extensive police search and no trace has been found of her. Not only that, but the old lady who owns the house next door, Mrs. Orchard, of whom Clara is very fond, has gone into hospital, asking her if she will look after the cat while she's in hospital and saying that she will be home soon. But it's been weeks and weeks and she's not come back. So Clara is bereft and very isolated by the fact that her parents, in their attempts to spare her anxiety about Rose, keep telling her that everything is all right. And she knows full well 7 is plenty old enough to know when your parents are completely distraught. So she's not in a good way either. And now here comes this man, which makes everything worse. The third character is Mrs. Orchard. She is in hospital. She is, I think, 72, which is younger than I was when I started writing. No, older than I was when I started writing the book, and significantly younger than I am now. And she is very ill and is looking back on her life and thinking about one particular period in her life during which an action of hers caused a tragedy for 2 families, and in particular for one small boy. And she has regretted this for 30 years and is desperate to do something about it. And there seems to be nothing that she can do. So essentially, the story rotates through these 3 characters, and you follow their coming together in a sense, and the way that they influence each other accidentally, without intending to. So basically, that's the gist.
Wow. I'm imagining many people are going to put a hold on the book right now if they haven't already, because it is a wonderful book if you haven't read it. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit how you develop characters, because I find that, specifically in this book, but I found in all of your books that you've written, characters are really, the center point for your novels, and character development is I don't know. I'm not a good writer, so I can't say how it is, but I can imagine it must be quite a challenge to sort of develop those characters. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how you develop your characters.
Well, it is a challenge, but it is also the bit that I enjoy the most. People say, but you must base your characters on somebody. And the answer is no, certainly not. I want to know them inside out and backwards, and you can't do that with anybody else, and it would be very restricting. I invent them. They come And sometimes they're easy, like Clara in this case. I kind of got a sense of who she was straight away. Um, Liam Kane, the man next door, was extraordinarily difficult. I struggled with Liam for more than a year, I would say, trying to figure out who this guy was and what his principal problem was. But if I go back to a former book, The Other Side of the Bridge, just by way of an illustration of developing character, I started there with the idea of farm boy, a big solid lad. Um, I couldn't figure out who he was, but I knew he wasn't very exciting, certainly not very articulate. Um, and I knew that he was the hero, an unlikely hero, but nonetheless. And I thought, well, I'm going to need some way of demonstrating who he is. So I decided to give him a brother. And I gave him a brother, Jake, who's 5 years younger, and everything that Arthur is not. He's smart and funny and very good looking, and in every way, he has Arthur beat hands down. And I gave him, in the first scene, a knife. When I was young, my older brothers used to play a game called Knives, which involved a hunting knife and two kids standing opposite each other about, 6 feet apart, and throwing a knife as close as they could get to each other's foot. And the idea was to make the other guy do the splits in as many moves as possible. In other words, throw the knife as close to his foot as possible and see how many times you could do this. Now, in the book, I have Jay insist that this be done barefoot, because otherwise, what's the point? He says. In fact, my brothers did not do it barefoot, I'm glad to say. But by the end of the scene with the knives, I knew who Jake was, all right. I knew the younger brother had a real problem with his older brother, although that shouldn't be the way around it was. And I knew who Arthur was. And I knew that that the story was going to be about the trouble between them. And I knew how it was going to end. So all of that just came out of putting one character into a scene with another. And all the way through writing my books, that has been key. I say Liam was the hardest character to write in a town called Solace. And although I knew his background very well, I knew that he had had an extraordinarily difficult childhood. And I knew in theory how that was going to affect him, but I didn't really get a sense of who he was until I put him into a scene with Clara. And then I got it. I got him. I understood him. And the story could progress from there because I knew how they would react with each other. Now, I was very lucky with Liam in that, having had this very difficult childhood, I knew that there would be consequences for him in adulthood, and I wasn't clear on what they would be. But my sister was a psychoanalyst, and we spent many, many hours on the phone discussing what the consequences are for a child, a young child, who goes through trauma at an early age, and what the effect of that will be, and what the limitations on his life will be, his or her life. So I had that constraint with Liam. I knew that there were things that he would not be capable of, and others where his nature might in fact triumph over his nurture. And the question was, which was it going to be? And I found him a very interesting character to work on. Elizabeth, the third character, I found quite easy because she and I are very much of an age. Although, for complicated reasons, I had to have her born in 1900. And I have to say, I'm not that old. So she is 72 when we first meet her. And the incident that she has regretted all her life took place in 1942 during the war. So her character developed through that. Yeah, so that's basically how it goes. Everything hinges around them. When I wrote The Other Side of the Bridge, I had Arthur born in 1920. And there was a reason for this, but it didn't occur to me until I was completely committed to the book and the storyline, and Arthur himself, that meant he was going to be 19 at the outbreak of the Second World War. And I was completely horrified because I hate doing research, and it meant I was going to have to find out how Northern Ontario was affected by the war. And it turned out to have a huge effect on the story. The war did, and I was forced into that research. I really disliked it, but it had to be, the war had to come into it. You can't ignore a little thing like a world war. So that had to fit around the character. The character came first, and the same has been true with all the books. Elizabeth has to be born in 1900 because other things have to take place when they do, you know.
How do you keep track? Like, how do you keep track of all that information? Because even just hearing you describe it all, I'm like, wow, like there's just so much, right? Like the characters are like to you, like in your mind, they're real people, right? Because you've built such a backstory for them, right? But how do
Oh,
you
yeah.
keep track of all of that?
Well, I don't. I'm a really chaotic writer. I so wish that I could plan it out. I think most writers do. They have some idea what the story's about when they start, whereas I have none. And a lot of them even have an endpoint that they're working towards. And I don't know what the end's going to be until I get there, pretty much. And so the storylines are all over the place. And then I realized partway through that that's not going to fit. And I have to go back and start again and make somebody older, or, you know, have an event so that it all actually works. I have to stretch the time that somebody does something in order for someone else to catch up with them. So Clara and Liam, who live side by side, their stories are so different. And yet, within that, you have to arrange for them to meet and for that meeting to have consequences. And boy, was it ever hard work. It took me a long time. I ended up doing a timeline, which amounted to 3 pages of dates of who did what when, and then trying to juggle them. So the inside of my head is a real mess, and the process of making the book not be a real mess is a really lengthy one. And my editors go crazy saying, I don't think this fits. I have to look at it again.
Wow. I Thank goodness for the editors, right?
Oh, thank goodness for the editors. What would we do without editors?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So Kathleen has a question for you. She wrote, I read this book several months ago. I loved it. I know you have a forward letter to the reader, but could you tell us again how you get inspiration for your stories?
It varies, and it's my biggest problem. It's the reason I have only written 4 books in 75 years. Um, I just, I, I have to wait until I have an idea, and the only way to get it is to immerse myself in other things and hope that I make connections. Now, with this book, as I say, I I got this idea of this little girl and uh, watching a man carry boxes into the house next door. And that was all I had to start. And then um, I was watching television, and there was a newscast about with an interview with a husband and wife. Their child had gone missing, and it was just devastating to watch. And I noticed that quite rightly in the course of the interview, the siblings were never mentioned. And I thought, yeah, they won't want them exposed to the media or to publicity. They'll want to protect them as much as possible. But then I thought, it must be absolute hell for the siblings because their parents will be distraught. And if they are young, they really won't know what's going on. And I thought, okay, that is Clara's situation. She has a sibling who has gone missing. So that was the spark, if you like, for her storyline. Now, if I go back to Road Ends, which is the book before this one, no idea at all what I was going to write about, and it was well over a year since I'd finished The Other Side of the Bridge. And I was on a book tour in Sweden, and I had an afternoon off, and I went into the art gallery in Oslo, and they have a room specifically devoted to Edvard Munch, who did Scream. You know that really horrifying picture. And he did a number of different versions. And on a plaque beside one of them, it said that his friends at the far end of the bridge seemed to be unaware of his anguish. Now, I'd never noticed the friends before, but sure enough, there are 2 guys talking to each other at the other end of the bridge, paying no attention to this guy. And I thought, boy, he is clearly at the end of his rope. What if he jumps? What if he kills himself? And they never even noticed the state he was in. What's that going to do to them? And that was the trigger for Road Ends. And it all grew out of a character whose friend commits suicide, more or less in front of him. So it varies enormously where the ideas come from. And basically, I don't get many. And I'm without an idea now, and it's starting to really bother me. I think, okay, so it's been a long time since I finished that book.
When's it coming?
Nothing has happened. Nothing's happened before so far. But if it does, I will write about it. And it will be set in the north because that gives me a chance to go home inside my head. And it also gives me a chance to go home, literally, COVID permitting, to do research. For instance, with this book, I needed to talk to a policeman, an old policeman, because he needed to have been the only cop in a big area of Northern Ontario 50 years ago. And I said to one of my brothers who lives up north, do you know any cops who were up here back then? And he said, oh, yeah, sure. And so when I went over visiting, when I went over visiting, I went to see him. And he gave me information. He was responsible for 3 towns and a bunch of little communities and 2 lumber camps, all on his own. And I said, what happened if there was trouble? I was thinking of the lumber camps. They're not the easiest places, notoriously. And I said, do you have backup? Is there somebody you can call? And he said, where? There isn't anywhere. It was him. And I said, I want to know if you would ever enlist a member of the public to help you if you really needed help. And he said, I did whatever it took. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. That means that this guy pretty much has carte blanche up there. He is the law, and he would have been young back then, you know. And that bit of research, the research where you actually talk to people, is just fabulous. I mean, I also met for the other side of the bridge a doctor who was a doctor up there, all on his own, the only doctor for 100 miles in any direction you care to go. And he gave me information that I could never have got anywhere else. For instance, I wanted a guy to bleed to death. And I said, what happens in a situation like that? You're not going to have bottles of plasma. You're not going to have a defibrillator. But what happens? And he said, well, basically your heart stops. There's not enough blood going through it, so it's going to stop. And I said, what did you do? No defibrillator. And he said, well, let me see, what year was this? And I said, 1958. And he said, we didn't know you could restart the heart. We didn't know that until 1960. We knew you could shock it, but we didn't know about CPR. And he said you would do a person-to-person blood transfusion to try and get blood into this guy. You'd have whoever was handy lie down beside him, and you'd stick a needle in both arms and put blood from one into the other. I said, how did you know when it was too much? And he said, oh, he'd go get the donor. All these things. He put a bell on his dock if he went fishing so that people could ring the bell if they needed him. The sound of a bell carries over water. All this information you could never find in a book. You've got to go and talk to somebody who did the job. And that has been tremendous fun. I've really enjoyed that. And people like talking about their jobs. You know, they're interested in talking about them because, generally speaking, they're pretty interesting jobs.
Wow, that brings like a completely different context to everything, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of widens it. You get a picture of a community. My source there is always a library. I went into the library in New Liskeard in Northern Ontario when I was researching the other side of the bridge and said, I need a doctor who was a doctor here way back when. I also need somebody who worked their land with horses because I have a farmer who still does that back in the 60s. And libraries are fantastic for a start. You guys are all extremely helpful. And secondly, you've got research tools right there. And you know everybody. You know everybody in the community if it's a small community. So I've always had, really wonderful help from librarians wherever I've been.
That's a
So
plug
there
for
you
us. I
go.
appreciate that. Thanks, Mary.
There's a plug for you. No, it's quite true.
So kind of going off what you were just saying, but a question from Andrea. And so she wrote, "You do a wonderful job in portraying what Northern Ontario is really like." She grew up in Thunder Bay. Have you continued to spend time there as an adult to get inspiration?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We go there, and I've taken my children there and my grandchildren, and we go at every opportunity. I mean, I until recently went every year and sometimes more than once a year, and I always go north. Um, Although we only had a summer home up there, but still, as far as I was concerned, that was home. And the landscape of Northern Ontario is what I think of when I think of home. Um, Southern Ontario was where I went to school. That's not the same as really living. The real living went on in Northern Ontario, and it's fantastic still. It's changed enormously. The area that our cottage is in, has changed a lot, but the landscape has not. That is still there. And if you go off season and pick your time, it is just magic still.
Um, so I have a question for you. The setting becomes a character, I find, in your books. So what is the inspiration for the setting of your books in small town Canada? Obviously, your background and everything, but they basically become the character themselves as well. Are they fictitious places, or do you kind of really base it off of the town that you grew up in, or do you kind of spread it out a little bit with adding information into it, or
Well, they are fictitious. None of them actually exist. And they are an amalgam of all the places that I know in the north and also in southern Ontario, in the little farming community I grew up in. I shipped it 400 miles north um, because in my first book, Crow Lake, I wanted to write specifically about a small isolated farm community, and I thought no one would believe that it was that isolated in southern Ontario back then. It was, but you wouldn't believe it today. So I moved it way north. And having got into the Canadian Shield landscape, I thought, this is just heaven writing about this because it brings back so much. And I've, I've just carried on with that. But the landscape up there, the thing is, in all of the books, a sense of isolation is fundamental to the stories. You need people to be, the plots need people to be thrown together. I can remember in Crow Lake, um, one of the readers said to me, when those children are orphaned, why didn't social services step in? And I said, there were no social services. There was no town nearby. There was the community, and the community did what it could. And it goes to form very close communities for good or for ill, you know. Um, Small places have their problems for sure. And when I was a kid, I couldn't wait to get out of this little claustrophobic place where everybody knew your parents. It was, you couldn't sneeze without everybody knowing about it. And when I went to Montreal, I thought I was in heaven. I was a student there, and it was just the most amazing experience. But I think that growing up in that community and in the north, having the uh, what we all consider to be our ancestral home in the north, having that in the family did have a profound influence on who I am and what matters to me. And although I was writing for many years before I was successful, it wasn't until I set a book in Canada that I had success. And I think it's because the things that you take in before you're old enough to even be aware of it are really fundamental to you in the way that your accent is. You're not aware of them as a child, but you are influenced by everything around you, and it goes to form who you become. And I think I was able to write about it with an authority that I couldn't write about England with to this day, although I've lived well over half my life here. I don't know it in the same way that I know Canada because I did not grow up here. So I lack the history, I lack the understanding of what was important to people, what were priorities, how did they see themselves, what were their problems, what was the day-to-day life like. I lack that. Although there is a restriction there on my writing because I left Canada in 1968 and I came over here for a holiday and met a guy, that's how it goes. And he's in the living room here in case of technical problems. And I got stuck. So my kids and grandkids are, they have joint nationality, but they were brought up here. But they know home. But I am not comfortable writing much beyond the early 70s because I don't know what it was like then. And I prefer to know what I'm talking about when I'm writing so that I limit the number of mistakes I can make.
Yeah, I hadn't ever thought of that, but it's so true. I I didn't grow up where in Lethbridge where I live now, but I grew up in Toronto and that's fundamentally who I am. Like I'm very much even though Lethbridge is a smaller community, I'm very rushed because that's where what I was used to, right? But I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of it, but like that's so true.
Yeah.
That
The volume is fading out, Carolyn.
oh,
However, I did get what you're saying, yes, and it does stay with you.
yes.
And if anything, it becomes more pronounced the older you get. You become more aware of your roots, if you like. Um, Partly, I mean, through seeing your children and seeing your grandchildren, and think, oh, I know where he got that particular. You follow the family links back, and also I have spent so much time as a writer thinking about Canada, thinking about the North. Had I not lived there, I'm sure I wouldn't have. I would have written about something quite different. Um, but this has been a focus going back in my head to how things were and what people's problems were at that stage, and the fact that essentially problems are just the same now. I became aware at the end of writing this book. It was finished before COVID started, but I was still in the editing process. And I became aware that people are profoundly important to each other, even people that you don't know well. You have an influence on other people that you're not aware of. And in this book, the way that people interact with each other um, is intensified by the community. There is no one else to turn to, and you can't get away from people. I mean, Liam, the character, the man in the book, is a very unsociable character, but he cannot escape the people of this community because they're used to knowing everybody and knowing everybody's business. And that, I think, has kind of been mirrored in the experience of COVID, certainly here in the street that I live on, a little street in Kingston, not far from London. We all know each other now in a way that we did not before COVID, because we have been forced to rely on each other because we couldn't go out, couldn't go anywhere, you know. And I thought there are similarities. There are the same pressures on people now that there always have been. It's just that the circumstances in which you live have changed. And that's been kind of interesting to see as well.
Yeah, one of the things you were talking about before was like almost like the character of isolation is in your books because of where you set them, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, that aspect of your books and why it's so important to address that isolation. Because I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand how that really impacts you as a person or impacts your story or I don't know.
It's kind of hard to do that because it is what I grew up with, therefore it's normal. Whatever the situation that you grew up with is how you think everybody grew up. And if I think of, you know, walking to school along a road which cars didn't pass along. I mean, I walked to school from when I was 6, and my mother certainly didn't have to worry about the traffic, you know. And everything was very close knit. The weather mattered tremendously. And I put that into books because I remember so clearly. The winters in southern Ontario, in the part where I lived, back then, we were in a serious snow belt, and you had to tunnel your way out kind of the house, like sometimes literally. And shoveling out the driveway was my brother's responsibility and so forth. The weather mattered. Waiting for the school bus, not knowing if it had gone into a ditch again. You know, the landscape and the weather played a big role in our lives. And also, it was a farming community, and to the farms, the weather is all that matters, basically. And the clearing of land was still going on when I was growing up. It probably still is, you know, for farms. So it's hard to step back and see that where I live now is just 10 minutes walk from the center of Kingston, which is quite a big town on the Thames outside of London. And seeing all these apartment buildings rising up all over the place, to me is still, I can't quite imagine what it must be like to grow up like that. Whereas outside the door for us, there was woods and the lake, you know, and it's just, it stays with me. And that is the reason why I consider that landscape still to be home, I think, because that's how it was. That's who I am. It's part of who I am still.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. We're just at the end of our time now. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming and joining with us today. Maybe one time you'll be in person.
Oh, wouldn't that be
Come to
lovely?
Southern Alberta.
I'd be delighted. I will definitely drop in and see you all.
Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you.